So much. Again, I apologize, everyone. We're so used to these things working that I'm surprised when they don't. All right. So I'm going to talk to you about our work, which is to try and disrupt healthcare, which, you guys are all pretty young. You probably don't think about your health so much. But as you get older in life, you'll see people, things don't always go the way you hope. And so people get very concerned about their health. And obviously, as they start hitting their 50s, especially, then people get very, very actively. And these days, healthcare is really turning into a data management system, if you will. And this is where the bioinformatics kicks in. And bioinformatics and big data are really disrupting healthcare. And so that is the theme of what I'm going to tell you about today. We want to disrupt the way we practice healthcare today. I'm pretty sure 20 years from now, it's not going to be at all what it looks like today. And we're doing this with deep data. And I'll tell you about some fun work with remote monitoring. So, first of all, I'm going to just start with a premise that many of you may or may not appreciate. What we really do these days is practice sick care, not health care. And when we do practice healthcare, we do it in a pretty Byzantine fashion when you think about it. Typically, what you'll do is you'll get in a car or some sort of other public transportation to travel to a physician's office. It's always at an inconvenient time. Nobody ever has time to go to the doctor. When you arrive there, the doctor's office looks pretty much the same as it's looked for the last 40 years. While you're there, they'll stick a needle in you and pull out a lot of blood. And of course, sometimes that hurts. And from all that blood on the time you're there, they actually don't make very many measurements, relatively few. And some of them, I would argue, are questionable. And then from those measurements, they'll treat you based on population averages. What is your average relative to everyone else? And we think all these steps can be corrected. And that's a big theme of our work. And deep data is part of this. And actually, with regards to this last point, you've probably been told since you're little, your temperature when you put a thermometer in your mouth is 98.6. But if you look at the data that are out there, first of all, that's not correct. The median value is more like, so the average value is more like 97.5. This is a very typical study. Big study out of Stanford just had it at 97.7. But the more important point here is there's a spread. This is actually what's called a 25th quartile, where 25% of people are. 99.1 is the 75th percentile, where the upper end are. And so what that means in today's world is if this is your normal healthy baseline and you go to a physician's office and they measure you at 90.6, they're going to tell you everything's healthy, everything's fine. What are you doing here? Go home, you're normal. But if you're up 4 degrees over your baseline, I guarantee you're not healthy. Something's off. And I'm sure all of you know this. When you get a temperature, you don't feel well. Even 1 degree can be a big deal. So that's a big theme of our work. Know what your healthy baseline is so you can see shifts from that baseline. Now, your health is influenced by many things. It's influenced by your DNA. But when you get down to it, it turns out DNA counts for about 16% of people's lifespan. All these other things impact your health. And we know this intuitively, like being active, exercise, the food you eat, mental health, environmental exposures. These will all impact your health. And we're in a world where we can now quantify this. We can actually sequence people's genomes, follow their exercise, so on and so forth. Some of this we can do very well, like these we do with activity trackers. Other things are still pretty clunky, but we're getting there. And pretty soon you'll be able to measure everything. And even if you don't directly measure these things, you can indirectly measure their effects by doing deep data profiles on people. And that's thanks to a revolution of various technologies that have come about in, say, the last 15 years or so. And specifically, many of you may know it's now possible to sequence people's DNA. So we have, if you will, 6 billion letters making up our DNA, and they're now fancy machines that will sequence us. And in fact, it's now roughly $100 for the reagents to actually sequence someone's DNA. And pretty soon it'll be even cheaper. Now, the interpretation is still a lot more expensive. But can you imagine you can actually get your DNA sequence for $100? That's the price of a nice meal. On top of that, there's been a revolution in these instruments called mass spectrometer. You probably have seen them at the airport. What they do is they're very, very sensitive instruments for detecting small molecules. And with these, you can actually follow all the molecules in your blood and urine, so you can get a very deep picture of all those molecules. And there's also been a revolution of wearables. And I can't see you very well, actually at all, but I don't know if any of you are wearing smartwatches like Fitbits or Oura Rings. I myself wear a lot of these. We'll talk about this. But these turn out to be very, very powerful devices for collecting data as well. And so by collecting all these different data types, you can actually get very, very deep profiles on people. And so many years ago, about 13 and a half on me, we set up something, it's a project we call it personal omics profiling, where we'll sequence people's DNA once and make predictions about the risk. And then we'll measure as many, many molecules as possible out of people's blood and urine. And we even actually analyze your poop. I don't know if this crowd knows about this, but you may or may not know you have more bacteria in you and on you than you have human cells, believe it or not. We're mostly bacteria. And a lot of it sits in our gut. It digests our food. It's called the microbiome. Very, very essential for breaking down our food and making essential vitamins, things like that. So we set up a project to actually collect all these samples, do these deep data profiles. This is on deep clinical tests. Some of you have had these if you go to a doctor's office, but we test much deeper. We have some advanced tests like stress echocardiograms, glucose control measurements, and wearables we started putting on people back when they were initially just fitness trackers. We said, well, these are probably pretty powerful health monitors. So one aspect of this is to take very, very deep data on people. And the other aspect is to profile them over time. So for example, oops. Are you still seeing my desktop? I closed something that was blocking my screen. I hope that's a yes.
Nope, we see only your slides. You're good.
Okay, good. Yeah, something weird happened on mine, as long as it's still working. So anyway, do you see my arrow though and stuff? Is that working as well? Okay. All right. Well, anyway,
Sorry, it takes some time for me to load back in.
yeah. Anyway, we're one aspect take very, very deep data on people. We're literally measuring, tens of thousands of molecules in their blood and sequence their DNA and have the sensors on them. And then the other aspect is do it longitudinally. So we'll sample people every 3 months while they're healthy. And then if an adverse event comes along, like a viral infection or something like that, we take 5 to 7 more samples. You might say, why are we doing all this? By the way, we've been running this on a small group of people for a little over 10 years. We're up to 171 people now. And as I say, you might say, why are we doing all this? We're trying to understand what it means to be healthy. How does that change over time? What happens at the earliest times of illness? What's the difference between you and the other people on this Zoom, on this call? How are we similar? How are we different? And then from a health perspective and relevant to the bioinformatics side of this, can we use these advanced technologies like sequencing people's DNA, these other molecular measurements? Can they use to better manage people's health? And with regard to this last question, the answer is yes, we can. Oops, now. I did lose it here. I can't advance my slides. All right. So this is getting very interesting. All right. Let's try it this way. Is that working?
Yep, that worked.
All right, good. I think I switched it back now. So I apologize once again. Anyway, so back to this point. So we're doing these deep data measurements on people and we're following them over time. And what I can tell you is just in the first 3.5 years, we had 49 major health discoveries, meaning we found all kinds of interesting things on people from this deep data dive. And they spanned a wide range of areas: hem-oncology, cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, so on and so forth. And some of these were a big deal. So, for example, we caught some with early lymphoma. These two things here, these are pre-cancers that can convert to aggressive cancers. We had 2 people with very serious heart issues, one picked up from gene sequencing, another from actually wearables. So, and that's another lesson. These are all found pre-symptomatically, and no one technology found it. So sometimes it was a gene sequencing, sometimes of the wearables. It varied from person to person. The way we like to think about it is what we're doing is we're getting a very, very deep picture of people's health. So we're trying to get more like 500 or 600 pieces out of a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. Whereas the way we do things today, we typically measure just a few, say 5 or 6. We're getting a much, much clearer picture. And that reveals all these things pre-symptomatically. It turns out that genome sequencing was very powerful. So 12 people learned something about their genome from this, about their health from their genome sequence. And I'm not sure if any of you have heard of this. If folks have heard of You can put it, comment in the chat or Q&A, but many of you these are single gene mutations that can put people at high risk for disease. And a classic case is something called BRCA, where a mutation in this gene puts women at very high risk for breast and ovarian cancer, men at risk for breast cancer as well. And so we actually did pick up one of the individuals did have a BRCA mutation. Others had other mutations that suggest that they're at risk. So knowing these things, seeing these in people's DNA, turned out to be very powerful. And there are informatic programs for actually being able to pick this up. So now I'm going to get into something that's a little bit more complicated, but it's great from the bioinformatics standpoint. These are what are called single gene mutations. Single gene mutations put you very high risk for disease. But there are other kinds of mutations. Most diseases are thought to be due to not single gene mutations, thought to be due to combinations, very common changes in our DNA. So many of you may know we have about 4 million changes that make us different, one person different from the other. So we have 6 billion letters, but 4 million of those differ between one person and the next. And so what people think is that most diseases, they're actually due to combinations of those 4 letters, those mutations that would actually lead to disease. And so we've come up with a way of analyzing. They call that complex disease. So no one change causes it. Yeah, I guess I left an intro slide. So no one change causes that, but instead it's actually thought to be due to lots of effects or lots of changes that if you get all the bad ones, you wind up high risk. And if you get good changes, you're actually low risk. That's how most common diseases are thought to work. And that's true for diabetes or, coronary artery disease, most diseases. So we've come up with a new way of analyzing genomes using machine learning and AI, artificial intelligence. And we've applied it to these things. I won't have time to tell you about all of them. But these new methods, they basically let us find a lot more of what's going on in these complex diseases. And I'll walk you through one example. This disease here, abdominal aortic aneurysm, it's kind of like the name sounds, the aorta bursts and people die. And in fact, that's how the disease is uncovered, when people's aorta bursts and they die. So it's a terrible way to know you're at risk for something. You obviously want to have predictive models if you can. So we've come up with a whole new way of analyzing this, as I say, where basically what you can do, here's the little background on this. So it's known to be highly heritable, but the genes underlying it weren't really known. As I say, it's thought to be due to combinations. And as I say, but generally when it's discovered, it's when people's aorta bursts and they die. So what we did was we came up with a way of sequencing basically about 268 cases and 133 controls. These are people who had AAA. These are controls. And what we do is we determine their DNA sequence and then use something called machine learning. So I don't know how much this crowd knows about machine learning. And I'd ask you to raise your hand, but I honestly can't see. I wonder if I can see you guys. If I turn this, no, still not that easy to see you. Oh, well. Anyway, we'll, I'll just assume. So the way machine learning works is that it can grab groups of genes. It looks for combinations that would be, in this case, enriched in cases relative to controls. And you run all the right parameters and pull this off. The power of this is that it's nonlinear. It can pull off all these, groups. And in the end, it pulled out 60 genes that were enriched in cases relative to controls. And you can even mix in other kinds of data with it. We had some electronic health record data. And basically, the bottom line is that we could get a much, much clearer picture of the genetics behind this very, devastating disease using these AI-based methods, these machine learning methods. And we could even go on, and we went on to show they were actually the right kinds of genes. So they were involved in these processes like aneurysm and cardiomyopathy. These are sort of things you would expect. And here's what I was going to say. They actually, you can build a risk score. So we can actually, from your DNA sequence, now predict people's risk. And it's all because we had this whole new AI machine learning approach to be able to uncover the genetics of this. So we can come up with a decent risk prediction score. And we hope to put this in the clinic and then save people's lives. The other thing we can do, because we're tracking how people We're tracking them molecularly over time, we can actually see how they're aging. So we can follow the biochemical pathways that are changing in people's blood. And it turns out everybody's aging differently. So this person, they're a cardioager, excuse me, meaning their top biochemical pathway that changes is something called a cardiac hypertrophic signaling pathway. It's a heart pathway, if you will. For this person, their top pathway, this is involved in immune function. They also have metabolic pathways changing. We think you need as little as 5 time points, and we can see how people age. And so we've classified people into ageotypes. And we're just, for this, we're only statistically empowered to find 4, although I know there are many, many more. Basically, kidney, liver, metabolic, immune. These are the ageotypes we uncovered. We know there's cardio and others as well. And so what happens is if you look at each row is a different ageotype, each column's a different person. And the 4 people over here, they're aging in all 4 categories. This person's aging in 3 of the 4, not much of a kidney ager, but aging in the other categories. This person's a kidney ager, kidney and metabolic, and so on. So again, we can see how people are aging. It's pretty cool. And it turns out the information's actionable, meaning there are clinical markers associated with these. And so as we see these clinical markers change, people actually adjust their lifestyle to better actually, improve their aging patterns, if you will. It's kind of cool. So as I say, we've gone on, sorry, this got put out of place, but we've gone on with our genomics to show that other debilitating diseases, ALS, really, really very debilitating. I'm sure many of you know. There were 7 genes known, and we have a whole new method and found 700. So we think again that genetics is very, very powerful. Now, one question I get asked a lot is how are you going to scale this? What I showed you is a research project, no question. But how are we going to get this out, to the world? And so I'm in Silicon Valley. So what we do is we form companies. We're pretty good at that here. And so we formed a company, Cube Bio, that does a medical version of what I just showed you. It stays much more focused on actionable data, meaning from doing deep data dives, we can and we follow what's going on and with information that people can act on. And same thing as we had found just pre-symptomatically, we caught someone with early ovarian cancer, prostate, even found someone with early pancreatic cancer, which by the way is almost never never found early. It's pretty much always found late. So these are, again, found all pre-symptomatically. So again, by doing these deep, deep data dives on people, we can better see what's going on. So the other thing we've been working very, very hard on is this idea of Amazonizing healthcare. The idea is, why do you have to go to a doctor for most health measurements? You really could do a lot at home. And so we've been pushing 2 things. One is the wearables, the smartwatches I mentioned before, and the other is home microsampling. So you may or may not know there's thousands of devices out there now, mostly smartwatches or rings, but many other things as well that can track your health. And when these first came out, they were mostly just fitness trackers. We realized they're powerful health monitors. And so what we did is we put them on our cohort, and a group of 109 people. And what we discovered right away is we can tell when someone's getting ill from a simple smartwatch. And this thing here is called a pulse oximeter. Many of you have worn these. You put them on your finger and it measures your blood oxygen. And it turns out that right away we discovered you can tell when somebody's getting infectious disease. Actually, I figured out when I got my Lyme disease, of all things, with the simple smartwatch and a pulse ox. And so the story behind this is I was flying to Norway with these devices. And 2 weeks earlier, I'd been in rural Massachusetts where most ticks are Lyme infested. What I noticed as I was flying to Norway is my blood oxygen was abnormally low. It normally goes low on airplanes anyway, but it went extra low. And I noticed my heart rate elevated. I later saw my skin temperature went up as well. And so this is all pre-symptomatically. Again, no symptoms. And then I did get symptoms off and on. I did go to a physician in Norway who basically drew blood, saw my immune cells were up and said, yep, you've got a bacterial infection. You better take penicillin. And I said, no, I need to take doxycycline. That's what you use for Lyme disease. And sure enough, it was a little awkward, actually, but he did give in and gave it to me, cleared it right up. And you actually take it 2 weeks. When I got back, I tested, I was Lyme positive. by antibodies, even had some antigens. And I given blood before I left, so it's negative. So, um, yeah, you can see I measure myself a lot. So the point out of all this, we could see when I first got ill from a simple smartwatch and pulse ox. And I won't show you the data on this, but we went on the show that I had 2 years of data. Every time I was ill, I had 2 viral infections, the Lyme disease, and one time I was ill but asymptomatic. I know I was ill because I had a high marker protein called CRP. Every single time I could see my resting heart rate went up in advance of symptoms. Okay. So very, very sensitive. We wrote algorithms to show it worked, worked on me, worked on 3 other people, one of whom got sick twice. And then we published this thing, in 2017. Well, of course, along came COVID. I'm sure many of you maybe have had COVID. And when this burst out on the scene in case where we in the area we were in March 2020, we very quickly partnered with Fitbit. Oh, I should say, so we're in the middle of these waves now. There's another big wave hitting, and I'm sure it's going to get very big over the holidays. If you think about how we measure COVID now, we use temperature, which is actually a very, very flawed way to do it because half people don't get a fever when they get COVID. In these new devices, they're fine, but they when it's cold outside, they under measure. And certainly antigens and PCR tests are great ways to go, but you don't do them all the time because they're not that convenient. So we think smartwatches could be very, very impactful. And again, love to know how many of you are wearing a smartwatch. And so when the pandemic hit, we very, very quickly partnered with Fitbit, got 5,300 people enrolled. And we had 32 of them that actually had COVID while wearing the smartwatch. And they had a diagnosis day and a symptom day. And what we discovered is that this is our very first case. This individual was diagnosed here day 48. They had their symptoms the day before, day 47, but their resting heart rate jumped up 9.5 days prior to symptom onset. And so you'll see in a minute, we wrote a real-time detection system for tracking people's baseline and then looking for elevated signals over that. So it worked from this first study. We could show that 80% of the time, we could see a jump up in resting heart rate at or before a symptom onset. And the median was 4 days. So it turns out COVID has a long pre-symptomatic period, and we can pick up this. And so we went on to write machine learning algorithms again to be able to better pick up when people have an abnormal signal. Not only that, we went on to build a real-time detection system. Love to have all of you sign up. So here's the place to sign up, innovations.stanford.edu/wearables. And we built this real-time detection system. It's a cloud-based system. It can follow millions and millions of people at once. And what it's doing is it's tracking your baseline in a circadian fashion, meaning throughout the day. And then if you have an abnormal signal, either too high or too low, it's usually a combination of both, it'll set a red alert. And so it turns out it works. It's the same number 80% of the time. And here's one of our first cases again. Here's when this person first got symptoms. They were diagnosed the next day, but they were getting red alerts for 3 days prior to symptom onset. And this algorithm we wrote works for Apple, works for Fitbit, but we think it'll work for all devices. It even works in asymptomatic cases. Here's one here. This individual was diagnosed with Fitbit, had a Fitbit, was diagnosed here, but they were getting red alerts for 2 weeks prior to that symptom onset. So it turns out it's not specific for COVID, as you might imagine. It's really an anomaly detection system. It's looking for a jump up in signal. It's mostly resting heart rate, but it's a combinatorial signal, meaning resting heart rate, step, sleep. And we're trying to bring in more data types so we get better and better at this. I think we can do better than 80%. So other things will trigger red alerts. It turns out workplace stress is the number one trigger. Intense exercise, travel, all these things can do it. Most of these you can contextualize. It's pretty obvious. But stress, if you're sitting around and you're getting red alerts, you're either something mentally or physically is off. And then I should say, infections actually will trigger this as well. It turns out that this test is more sensitive. Your smartwatch is more sensitive than an antigen test. And here's a personal example. We have several like this, where in my case, I was getting ready to travel to New York City, and I woke up, I was a little bit congested. So I did an antigen test, and it was negative. That's what this one shows here. I looked at my smartwatch, and it was positive. What I got on the plane, went to New York anyway. And wouldn't you know it, when I to go to the meeting the next day, when I woke up, I had to get tested. I was bright positive. So I had to spend a whole week in New York City, all because I listened to my antigen test and not my smartwatch. So we think this is a very, very sensitive assay. For it's not specific. I didn't know I had COVID. I knew something was up. But in the end, I'm a lot more careful now when I get a positive red result. I will say that we're now trying to use these kinds of wearables for following long COVID, where there's these symptoms that extend, and we're setting up bioinformatics predictive models for trying to figure out who's going to get long COVID, who's not, and what the symptoms might be associated with long COVID. I will say that this is just the tip of the iceberg. We think wearables are going to be powerful health monitoring devices. They're incredible from a data and bioinformatics perspective. So, see, they actually shine light onto your blood, and then they measure spectroscopic shifts in that. And so what happens is you can actually get information about using machine learning. We can get signals from red blood cell counts, hemoglobin levels, etc., all from a simple smartwatch. Now, they're not clinical grade tests, but they're good enough to see if something's off. And that's really what we think is important for following medicine. Here's something called a hemoglobin A1C and fasting glucose, very important for diabetes. We can even get that from a smartwatch. So we think this information is very, very powerful. The other area we're doing a lot in is the area of continuous glucose monitoring. I don't know if you're familiar with these devices, but basically you put them on these little patches you put on your arm, and they measure your glucose control every 5 minutes. And they're turning out to be very, very transformative. You may or may not know 9% of the US population is diabetic, 33% is pre-diabetic, and most of them will become diabetic within 5 years. So we think it's very important to know how your glucose levels are going, and what spikes them, high levels and things like that. And so our claim to fame was we took these devices and we started putting them on normal and pre-diabetics, and some normal people had good glucose control. They didn't spike much. Other people were moderate spikers, and yet others were very, very severe spikers, just as bad as diabetic. We think it has something to do with the way it's measured. So we came up with algorithms for actually classifying people in the what we call glucotypes, low, medium, or high, based on their glucose level and spiking. And it turns out that one things we discovered is that different people spike to different foods. Some people spike to bread, others to bananas, others to pasta. It really varies from one person to the next. In many cases, it's thought to be due to your microbiome, but that only explains a fraction of what's going on. This is some work from Aaron Siegel's lab. He actually showed this individual that this person spikes a banana, but not a cookie. Probably the only person on the planet doesn't spike to a cookie. This person spikes a cookie, but not a banana, which is a lot more typical. One of the things we found is that 80% of people spike to cornflakes and milk. So we think this stuff is super evil. If you don't remember anything else from my lecture, just remember that this stuff's like poison. I think it's not good for you. I'd watch out for it. Probably worse than smoking. All right. So we think this glucose monitoring is very powerful. And again, it can train people which foods to eat, which don't. And in fact, it turns out even if you just wear a glucose monitor for 10 days, that's how long they were at the time. Now they last 2 weeks. But people will improve their glucose control. They call it time in range, the time your glucose levels are in the range you're supposed to be. And here's a good example here. Here's a person at the beginning of the 10 days and same person at the end, and their glucose, they're doing a better job managing their glucose spikes. The other area that we're working very, very hard on is this home microsampling. So this idea that you could give samples at home and we could do health monitoring. You basically get little pricks of blood, collect them, and we spent actually 7 years on this, collecting them into a very special device, sending by FedEx to the lab, and then we'll measure thousands of molecules in people's blood. We'll measure their lipids, metabolites, proteins, and these are targeted assays you can do. So as I say, we spent a lot of time on this. I know this area has a bad rep because of Theranos, you may have heard of. Anyway, ours works, unlike theirs. So bottom line is we showed actually that most proteins, metabolites, and many lipids are pretty stable when you run them through this procedure. And then we went on to run some really fun studies. So we had 32 people drink the shake. You may have seen it in a CVS store, basically. And then we profiled them before, 30 minutes, 60, 120, 240 minutes after drinking the shake. So they were fasted first thing in the morning and then did this. And what will happen is literally hundreds of molecules will change, will shift. And that's not a surprise. We expect the things they drink to go right into their blood, and or many cases. And we can follow things like insulin. This is a very interesting molecule called incretin, which is a big deal these days. C peptides from insulin, so on and so forth. So we can even follow inflammatory markers. And the cool thing we discovered from the shake study is that everybody reacted differently to the shake. Once again, very personalized responses. So here are 3 carbohydrates. People tend to behave the same for a particular class of molecules. So each box is a different person. This person, their carbs plummet after drinking the shake. For this person, they skyrocket, up. Let's see, that one's kind of flat. That one goes down. This one goes down as well. And so we could classify people. We use something called clustering analysis. I don't know if this group's heard of this, but it's a way of clustering, if you will, in this case, markers, relative within the group. So we have this group of 32, and it turns out they fall into 5 clusters. And once again, they're very, very interesting. So this gray is the average. It turns out that for the inflammatory response, for this group of people, their inflammation markers go down when they drink the shake. For this group of people, they go up. Same with this. So same shake having very different effects depending who you are. And what we think is that at some level, this is probably affects how your food intersects your microbes and your immune system. And 10% of people have something called inflammatory bowel syndrome. And we actually think, but nobody knows what causes it. We think we can measure it at a personal level. The other thing we're doing is this set of this type of analysis here. This is what we call the ultimate experiment. We had one person take samples every hour during waking hours for 7 days, total 98 samples. And they were wearing one of these continuous glucose monitors and a smartwatch at the time. And so we actually profiled them. And what we discovered, that they logged their sleep and activity and all that as well. And then we looked for these, what we call time lagged associations. The idea that if you're trying to find causative events, they should set upstream of downstream events. And so we can actually do these kinds of analyses to find, again, events that precede other events. It doesn't prove they're causative, but it's a good candidate. So what we did is we had, what this person do this. And what we discovered is there's thousands of associations between heart rate, glucose, and steps. So, and the purple here are the cytokines. These are your immune molecules. Blue are the lipids and the metabolites in green. And as I say, we found thousands of very interesting associations. Just to run through a few, this is like a control. People's insulin C peptide goes up after glucose. So you eat a meal, then you normally would release glucose. So we can measure it. It's 10 minutes in this person. Okay. The other thing we discovered, though, glucose is known to cause inflammation. And what we discovered is a whole new immune molecule, FLT3L, that also, it's a key immune regulator. It also goes up after glucose. So this might explain one of the ways in which people are getting, if you will, inflammation from glucose. Here's a super cool result. Alpha-synuclein, which has been implicated in dementia and Parkinson's, turns out we can track that. You can see it's bouncing around. We think it associates with stress as well. And so we think that if you're high risk for dementia, you might want to actually know what your alpha-synuclein levels are, because if you can get them better in control, perhaps you could push that off for a number of years. So again, we think this remote monitoring can be very, very powerful. So one way in which we're actually handling all these data, we think that the person is the best person to interpret their health. Physicians can help, no question, but a person has more time to spend figuring out themselves than a physician does. And so what we did was we built this dashboard. We call it My PhD. Brings a wearable, mixed data, this word I just said, all kinds of data, displays it on a dashboard where you can follow, daily, weekly, monthly, these various measurements. And so we actually think this will be powerful for helping better enable people to track their health. So this is where I see the world going. This is how we would like to really change healthcare monitoring. I see a world where people get their genome sequenced before birth. And then together with these omics measurements and wearable data, we'll be able to better track people. And we'll have personalized, I have one on me already, AI management systems where they can be used to predict disease risk, catch disease early, monitor and treat disease. So one question I get asked a lot again is how are you going to scale it up? And so I mentioned before, we form companies after we sequence my genome. We form Personalis, which does this. And as was mentioned earlier, I founded 17 companies over the years. This is our way of scaling this up. I think academics are great at discovery and proof of principle. We're not very good at scaling. And so these companies, this is our CGM company, January I, better tracks your glucose and actually has a whole behavior modification program. We think this is a big deal. YOLO is a metabolic health company. It does the microsampling, does little pricks of blood that you mail in, and we give you back a metabolic health report. Long COVID, we even have our own smartwatch company. I forget to say I wear normally about 8 devices every day. You can see my 3 smartwatches, perhaps my ring or a ring. They're all tracking away. So in summary, what I've told you is that health monitoring using big data and advanced technologies can be valuable. And to analyze these, you definitely need bioinformatics. You need very sophisticated programs. We think that remote monitoring using wearables is powerful for identifying infectious disease and other conditions. I mentioned about home microsampling can be used for tracking wellness and responses. And the most important thing is this last bullet. We're all different. We're all very different in our baselines and such. And so actually, for this tracking, A, it's kind of interesting. Why are we different? But B, it's going to be very powerful for health monitoring because you have to know your personalized baseline to see disease. So this is a team I had when they're at their peak, the wearables gang. These are the microsampling. I'd like to give a shout out to Xiao Shen and Ryan, who really spearheaded a lot of this. And the wearables is set up by Xiao Li and a whole team of people, Tejas Mishra, Mir Bahmani, and others. So I think I should have saved enough time for questions. And I'd be happy to take some if you have any. So.
Hi, I'm going to hop in here to answer. There's a couple that are popping into the Q&A. So the one that's been upvoted the most is, how could wearables be used in synergy? Can different detection methods be used together to be even more accurate? How would the machine learning algorithm communicate?
Yeah, great question. So the answer is yes. In fact, the more data types you bring in, the clearer picture you get of what's going on. And in fact, one of my companies, January AI, uses both the continuous glucose monitor along with the smartwatch to actually track people and build predictive algorithms. They can now predict your glucose without even having a glucose monitor. So these different data types, they really give you a much clearer picture of what's going on with your physiology and health. So, and then how to track it? Well, I think it's using these dashboards. I think in the future, you're going to get one from your physician's office as well, where the data really does come rolling back into your phone. I think your phone is going to be your most important health monitoring instrument in the future because it pulls in all your data. And these days, you may or may not know, your doctor has about 15 minutes to spend with you at a doctor's office. You may have noticed that. But it turns out, of course, you have a lot more time. And that's why I think it's really important for people to take better control of their own health. And so, yeah, we're big believers in that. Hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you so much. We have actually 2 more questions that have come in. That's been upvoted. A couple. We've got a handful coming in now. Individuals would like to know, could you please elaborate a little more on the cornflakes in milk? And is it bad for kids as well?
Oh, I'm sure. When you're younger, though, you have better glucose control than you do when you're older. So you probably will withstand it better. But it turns out that, yeah, you may not realize it, but people today eat 40,000 times more sugar than they did at the end of World War II. 40,000 times, right? It's ridiculous. And cornflakes is just loaded with fructose, which is probably the worst of the sugars. It actually really spikes you. So I think we should not be doing that, having cornflakes. And I'll tell you, that's very interesting. You Google it up. If you ask how much sugar is there in a bottle of ketchup, and then they actually show you what that represents, it turns out about 3/4 of the bottle would be filled with sugar. Okay, so ketchup is mostly sugar, and we just get so used to eating this stuff. It's really not good for us.
All right. Thank you for that. All right. Two things that kind of coincide. What obstacles do you foresee wearables having before they become mainstream? And kind of in conjunction with that is wearables get in the way of my comfort, i.e., I try to wear them overnight and my hands go numb. Are there other options that would work as well in data collection?
Great question. So, yeah, the main obstacles from getting adopted into the medical system are twofold. One is you always have to demonstrate utility. You have to show they have value, and even if you intuitively know they have value, you still have to prove it to get incorporated in the medical system. And they won't, or it won't happen. And so the devices themselves need to hit a certain compliance. Right now, these are just consumer grade devices. But believe it or not, a thermometer you put in your mouth actually has a certain certification. Not, it's very low grade. It's pretty easy to do. And that's where some of these smartwatches are going. Some of these then are getting actually a certified, like there is the Apple Watch is certified as a certified EKG you can measure. So again, I don't know if any of you are wearing any of these devices, but some of them. So gradually, and now what people are doing is that you may see if you have Fitbit or other, they actually have a stress test. That actually is based on the work I just described, which is to show that people, have shifts in their resting heart rate and other things, and they've developed their own algorithms for pulling in different data types to better make that assessment. So I think we need to actually show that these tests really work. We have to get them on approved devices. It takes years for this to move in, but I think it's a no-brainer. On the issue about comfort, yeah, I don't know what to say. I mean, the rings are pretty good. A lot of people don't like the watches for reasons you just said. You can see again, all my watches are rings, but a lot of people are very comfortable with rings if they don't like watches. Patches aren't so great because they cause inflammation. I mean, you wear them fine for 2 weeks, but you won't wear them. They're great for the glucose monitoring. So I think in the long run, you're going to see implantables where they're actually be put in under your skin, and then they'll measure you continuously that way. And they won't be inconvenient. They may set off the thing at the airport security. I don't know, but though that may be the easiest and passive way of monitoring yourself by these implantables. So we shall see what the future says. Try the ring though if you don't like the watch.
Okay, here I think we have one final question. Oh, hold on. They just move. When they get upvoted, they move around in the Q&A for me. Give me 1 second.
No worries. Yeah. Well, here I'll answer one with that. I see one on implantables and Big Brother.
Yes.
Yeah. So that raises the whole general issue about privacy. This gets brought up a lot with our work. Mike, aren't you scared of all that big data getting out there? And I guess I have two comments there. One is privacy, get over it. Nothing's private anymore, unfortunately. So, and the other is that I think these things have more potential for good than evil. And if there is evil, we should have laws to protect us from evil. What do I mean by that? Well, so I think being, having health monitoring is just very, very powerful. And it really does catch disease early before symptoms. And the good is quite good. The chances of being abused, I think they're not zero, but I think they're low. I will say that all of us have credit cards, maybe a lot of you on the phone or the Zoom call. It's not a Zoom, but this call all have credit cards. And yet we do that. That has incredibly private information, right? Probably much more private than your wearables that you wouldn't want to have shared. Yet we still have these credit cards because, nobody wants to walk around bags of cash. So we think the convenience and the benefits outweigh the bad. I think that's true of the wearables, that you should be able to, they will help you catch disease. But if someone's to abuse it, well, to me, that's the purpose of government. The purpose of government is to do things for people they can't do for themselves. and one is to protect themselves from abuse. So you wouldn't want someone to drop you. You may know already you can't get dropped for a job or health insurance from your genetic information. You can for long-term disability, which I don't agree with. I think you should get protected from that. So anyway, the point is we know if people start abusing people because of their wearables, whatever, well, then we do need laws to protect that.
Thank you for that. And we have a couple others. As you started speaking, a lot more have come in. I think you've raised some great points here where people are asking some additional questions on. With wearable devices, do you apply federated learning to send the model to the user's devices?
Oh, great question. Not quite yet. We pull in the data, we write our algorithms, we tune them to the particular devices like Fitbit or Apple that we're using. We do want to do what you're describing. To be honest, what I really want to do is have the way we do it now. Unfortunately, you have to click on the phone to see if it's a red day or a green day. Red day being not so good, you're up, something's up. Ultimately, we want to push the algorithms back to the phone so that way you can do it in real time. It'll give you a red alert in real time when something's off. And so for there, what we need to do is have our algorithm set, pushed onto your phone. Now, it is true that if we can keep pulling in different people's data from all these things, we can have a continuous learning system. You may have heard that phrase before. So we should be able to keep learning off of everybody's devices and then relay that information, build better algorithms to relay them back. That is the long-term plan. So we do want to do something that is very federated like. So you raising a great point.
All right. Sorry, it just jumped on me again. You guys have some great questions coming in here.
Well, Sam, I'll let you keep orchestrating this. There's a lot of good ones in here.
I know they do. I'm trying to follow along with the upvotes. I need to go in and mark the ones you've read already, or answered already. Excuse me. Are there ethical considerations in terms of insurance discrimination based on wearable health data?
Not on wearables. So potentially you could be discriminated against. Somebody could pull that in. I have not, we haven't seen that happen. Right now, most insurance and things are in a wait and see. My own view is you should get an insurance discount if you do wear a wearable device because you're going to take better care of yourself. Anyone who has a Fitbit, they'll work. If you hit 9,600 steps, you're going to walk those extra 400 to get your 10,000. So I think these devices, they really do stimulate you to take better care of yourself. They catch disease early. I mentioned the Lyme disease and other things. So my own view is that we should actually be paying people to wear smartwatches, to get your genome sequence, to collect these kinds of data, because I think you're going to take better care of yourself. Should I do another one? I see. Oh, you're muted there.
Sorry, I muted myself so you wouldn't hear me doing all the clicking. Yeah, go right ahead if you see one that I haven't asked yet.
Yeah, I see one. Here's a very different one. If you want, I can do it. Can you elaborate on the process of commercializing your research through a company? And I mean, that's a long answer, but I'll give you a short one, which is what we do. I'm an academic lab. We do science because we love science. It's what gets me up in the morning, gets me all excited. Nothing better than a great result. But every now and then we do things like the microsampling we'd love to see get out to the world. And so what you do is you file for patent protection, you protect the ID. Many of you know this, and then we will find investors who will give us money to start this thing. Sometimes there's people in my lab who want to be the person launching the company. Sometimes I'll spin it off and I go out and try and find someone who wants to be the so-called CEO. So, but yeah, there's a whole process. It takes typically about 10 years for a biotech company from start to becoming a mature, like that was true for Personal. So it took 10 years. You can get a product before that, but before they really get blasting along, it takes time. But it's a lot of fun because it's very satisfying to see some of the discoveries you made in the lab get out to the broader community. So.
Fantastic. Did I miss any others? Seth, feel free to.
Well, here's one about implantables and Big Brother.
Yes.
We sort of touched on that. I mean, it gets at this privacy issue, and as I say, I'm not so worried about it. I've never seen anybody abused by this stuff. So yeah.
All right.
I don't know.
I see two of them.
Oh, keep going.
Um,
Yeah, great.
so one is, how can wearables be used in synergy? Can different detection methods be used together to be even more accurate? And how would the machine learning algorithms communicate?
Yeah, so I think we might have touched on that already, but you do pull together different devices. The more data, a lot of the data are complementary. And then the machine learning, see, the machine learning treats each type of data as a feature. You probably know this already. So what you can do is you can grab different features and see which ones together give you the best signal. And a good example is something like glucose control. It is true that they're on your watches, they measure something called galvanic stress response, which is conductance on your skin. And when you have diabetes, your skin gets drier and so it doesn't conduct as well. So you get a signal for that. You also get a signal from inflammation from the resting heart rate and things. So what you can do, machine learning grabs those features, weighs them in a certain fashion to come up with an optimal algorithm, if you will, for what best attacks diabetes, what features are there, how to weight them. So the answer is it does pull together different data types, and you can do it from different devices. You can do it from a glucose control measurement along with the smartwatch. And we use machine learning all the time for all these different data types. The omics data I mentioned before, in particular, is quite powerful for the biochemical measurements. Okay. You said
All
there's
right.
another one too?
There's one more. You mentioned about COVID antigen tests showing negative, but your smartphone showing positive changes in your biomarkers. Are you using any standard applications on your phone that help measure these biomarkers, or are these apps that your lab developed? Are these apps that your lab developed, and are they still not public?
They're public. We make all of our algorithms public. It is an app, but it's on the physiology. The app is built. We don't have one yet built on the biochemistry for COVID detection. That's all built off your smartwatch. Turns out resting heart rate is just a great signal for telling if you're ill. So we're big believers in wearables for seeing the shift from baseline and finding, when you first get ill. Now, we can't always, as I sort of indicated in my talk, you can't always tell what kind of illness you have. Meaning, if you see a jump up in your resting heart rate, something's going on. It's not always clear whether it's mental health or a respiratory viral infection. But I'm 100% certain if we pull in more data types, we'll know the difference between those two because, respiratory virus affects your lungs. So all you have to do is pull in respiration rate. Just one last thought is the biggest problem, and I'll send this out to the crowd for you guys to think about. The biggest limitation in our work is getting the data. A lot of the companies don't like to share their data. A lot of researchers don't share their data. So being able to pull in the data types, like if we can pull in high resolution heart rate variability and respiration, I know for sure we'll tell the difference between mental health problems and respiratory viruses. I also know we can tell the difference between bacterial and viral infections as well from a smartwatch. So you just need to get more data and the right data types, and you'll get more precise diagnostics.
So I have one semi-related one.
Sure.
Do you have a favorite brand or make or model?
Yeah, it's not as easy to answer that as you think. It turns out that the number one problem in our studies is missing data. And you can impute it, you can guess what's missing. But it turns out then at the end of the day, even though they're not as high resolution devices, the Fitbit and Garmin, Fitbit in particular, it's lower resolution. They're still some ways more powerful because they have less missing data. They charge for 5 days, I forgot to say. Whereas the Apple Watch used to charge for 30 hours. So a lot of people, their battery runs out and then you're missing all this data. So if you're really good at charging, well, stay with the Apple Watch, a bit higher resolution. But if you're not as good, which is probably true for most people, well, then you probably want a Fitbit or a Garmin. And of course, the real answer to all this is one of my companies is a smartwatch company. It's called Sensomics. That, of course, is the best one, but that actually we don't sell to consumers. It's just the researchers for the moment.
Oh, that was going to be my next question.
So anyway, great questions, everybody.